Our first presenter is the National Project Coordinator of the ILO's Safe and Fair program in the Philippines. It is part of the Global European Union UN Spotlight Initiative to eliminate violence against women and girls. As you may know, Rex, this is a cause very close to my heart. Our speaker worked for 20 years in Hong Kong as a migrant worker and later as executive director of the Asian Migrant Center, a migrant research and advocacy NGO. He pioneered in 1995 the reintegration program for OFWs in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, based on the concept of migrant savings for local community development in the migrants' hometowns. He also pioneered the establishment of the trade unions of Filipino, Indonesian, Thai, and Nepalese migrant domestic workers, and the establishment of the first legally registered cooperative of migrants in Hong Kong called Asian Migrants Credit Union. From 1997 to 2011, he was a member of the Executive Committee of the Migrants Forum in Asia, the biggest Asian-based network of migrants organizations and civil society groups. In 2013, he returned to the Philippines and continued his advocacy and integration strategies for OFWs. He was a consultant trainer of the Joint Migration Development Initiative, jointly implemented by UNDP, NEDA, CFO, and LGUs. Of course, Rex, we crossed our path with this project we call JMDIs briefly. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our first speaker, Rex Marlo Varona. Rex, there.
Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Good morning everyone, no? And thanks Dr. Ma'am Melly.
Yeah,
Yes,
I'm not a
we
doctor.
kaya nga. I was about to say Dr. Stella, pero si Ma'am Melly pala yung
Okay.
moderator
A
ngayon. Thanks
doctor
so
either.
much. Yes. And as Ma'am Melly has said, we crossed paths before on reintegration, but now I'm going to present some regional perspectives on, can I share my screen? On the situation and challenges facing migrant workers. I'll focus on ASEAN and then also on, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I'll be focusing pretty much on what are the challenges, both the sending and receiving countries, and then on the prospects post-COVID. Essentially, thanks, Mameli, for giving the overview. So essentially, we know that COVID is still with us. So as you see, Philippines is the second most affected in ASEAN. I will not go deeply into that, but in the region, there are about 10 million migrant workers now. And of course, there are four major destination countries where Filipinos also are. And the Philippines is one of the five or so sending countries. I explain this a bit because this will impact later on the responses and strategies forward. And then migrant workers in ASEAN are normally in construction, agriculture, manufacturing, restaurants, hotels, and households. As you will see later, these are the areas where COVID has very strong effects, and therefore the displacement of migrant workers, including Filipinos, are very strong. So as I've said, across the region, the impact of the pandemic has been severe, especially because many of the migrants are in the more risk related work impacted by COVID, and also because the working and living conditions is very hard to do social distancing. Many of them are in dormitories, especially in Singapore, Malaysia, and other countries, and therefore at greater risk to COVID. So I'll focus the impacts more on the challenges on the access to information of the migrants during COVID, on the health risks that they face, on the impacts on their employment, on the social protection status that they have. Particular concern of ILO is on the housing conditions of migrants, and then of course on return and reintegration and recruitment and remigration after COVID. You will get a copy of these slides now, so I will not discuss all the details. But we did see early on in March that migrants did have quite a lot of access to information, and majority of them actually were aware of COVID and the possible impacts. Of course, there were kind of misconceptions in certain aspects, but overall they were aware of the pandemic. Migrants have been one of the more drastically affected sectors by the pandemic itself. In fact, there are about 14,000 Filipinos abroad, no, who have been who are infected by COVID, and back in the Philippines, among the returnees, more than I think 5 to 6,000, my last count, were actually also infected repatriates. So if we therefore add the cases of Filipinos abroad to the number of COVID cases of the Philippines, so there'll be 15,000 more cases than is currently reported by the government. Employment, the ILO estimated that as the whole of last year, more than 255 million equivalent full-time jobs were lost due to COVID. Uh, this is 4 times greater than all the jobs lost in the 2009 financial crisis. So that's why it's unprecedented in terms of impact on the jobs. And of course, impacts on wages and women having been differentially affected, more worse than men. I'm showing here a graph of the decline in deployment. Now, in the last 2 years, you will see more than 65% drop in the deployment of OFWs, both because we kind of restricted deployment, but also because the countries abroad were not receiving the migrant workers. Uh, I'll go back to that later on, no? But I'm also showing you that traditionally, even before COVID, this is the graph of where women migrants go in terms of work abroad, no? In the last 15 years. You will see that 80 or 90% of all our migrants women go into domestic work, elementary occupations. This is very gendered in terms of structure because also majority of them go to clerical work and also to services work. Again, these are the sectors of work where the effects of COVID are great. And so therefore, because of the structural composition of where migrants of OFWs go, then we see that more of the Filipino migrants and women have been impacted by COVID. Uh, Another big challenge during COVID and now is the social protection of migrants. Many of the migrants, although there are mandatory social protection schemes in the Philippines, na Pag-ibig, PhilHealth, SSS, many of them drop out of it. In fact, our last count, less than half of OFWs have been able to maintain or sustain their mandatory provident systems. But the non-contributory schemes also, many of the migrants are either marginalized or excluded, especially abroad. When they were back in the Philippines during the season of the SAP, no, the Financial Assistance Program, many of them were also not given because many of the local governments felt that the migrants have money and therefore they did not need assistance. So there's a weakness in the social protection for the migrant workers. I mentioned earlier that many of the migrants abroad live in crowded houses and accommodations, and therefore they were predisposed. In fact, this is one of the reasons why Singapore experienced a massive explosion of COVID cases in, I think, in August or September. That was because of the overcrowded situation in the migrant dormitories. Another major concern, especially after COVID, is the reintegration of migrants. As of last month, na February, DOH already reported almost 1 million, more than 900,000 Filipinos have returned. Not all of these are workers. Now, perhaps about half of this would be, but that also tells us how massive the work would be in terms of assisting them either to find work here, to find livelihood, or to remigrate abroad. But this is also true for many other origin countries in ASEAN, no? Cambodia, Myanmar, Indonesia, who experience tens of thousands of returning migrants. Uh, Approaching the end of the lockdowns, many migrants would want to remigrate because of the lack of reintegration opportunities. So then the age-old problem of problems with recruitment and deployment of migrants will resurface. And therefore, this is a big challenge that we need to address, especially after COVID. For women, there are specific the issues I raised earlier actually differentially affect women, and since many of them are in the more risky situations, then or in domestic work or in the caregiving industry, then the effects of them would be very particular. In addition to the general impacts that we observe among migrant workers. Many of the migrants are also in the health sector, especially the women, and therefore a lot of the cases, especially early on in the pandemic, no, in March to June, were actually women and health and domestic workers. Many of the reintegration and national contingency policies do not organically involve women. In fact, my personal aside, in the governance of IATF in the Philippines, we see very few women now, and it's therefore the organic participation of women in policymaking and recovery and gender responsive recovery approaches, especially in the Philippines, is a concern that needs to be addressed. And of course, there is the trafficking and smuggling because of the difficulties abroad and the pressure to remigrate after because of the economic crisis due to COVID. Okay, I'm flashing that even before COVID, the face of abuse of Filipino migrants is women in terms of trafficking, distress, and repatriation. COVID exacerbated this, and therefore, moving forward, the issue of how do we make sure that the rights and welfare of the women of the abused are properly protected against trafficking and gender-based violence. Okay, there are some responses that were done by various ILO programs. I will not detail this because you will have a copy of this. My program did a lot of work on the migrant resource centers at the local level and also across the different ASEAN countries, focusing especially on women migrants. ILO also the various projects did humanitarian assistance and wage protection issues. I think Stefan in his next presentation will deal more about the wage theft campaign that trade unions and civil society are doing. Yeah, but this echoes also ILO's position that one of the key strategies is really to make sure that the livelihoods and wages of migrants are protected as one of the ways to be resilient against COVID. And a lot of research and advocacy and coordination work across countries were done in response to COVID. So moving forward, I think the most important thing to do is there's a study by ILO that the impact is uneven and therefore the recovery is quite uncertain. The concern is if the recovery will take the shape of, they call this a K-shaped recovery, meaning to say after COVID and after the recession, the gray area, when you see the white field now, when recovery starts, the recovery will be differentiated in terms of it takes a K-shaped recovery shape because those that are in technology, in software services, those who have better pay will tend to recover faster, and in fact, they might benefit from the pandemic. However, those in the more vulnerable sectors are the ones that tend to be actually more adversely affected and therefore more difficult to recover. And this is, I think, one of the worst case scenarios that the world is trying to avoid. No, that this will increase the inequalities and will not be a better normal after COVID. Uh, wait, so in terms, therefore, of addressing forward, it's important to address the structural flaws in the labor market, especially migrants. As we were saying, addressing the wage and the housing differentials, uh, trying to push the equality of treatment and social protection between migrants and then the local workers. And of course, recognizing domestic workers' work so that they'll be properly and equally treated, especially in the destination countries, ending violence against women because this hampers or hinders recovery and also development, and strengthening labor migration governance. On the more specific aspects, we have to make sure that destination country and origin country governments do wage protection and support, especially for the workers who are severely impacted, so that we avoid the K-shaped recovery, that we make sure that return and reintegration strategies are inclusive, including accessing skills development and reskilling, especially for those 900,000 Filipino migrants who have returned to the Philippines now. And also, we need to ensure that the protocols and guidelines on recruitment and deployment will be strengthened once it kicks up again after COVID. On the more health-related ones, we need to make sure that the public health services, we need to do more systematic emergency and pandemic preparedness planning. We should learn our lessons. We should have learned our lessons from SARS-1, but now with COVID, then it's important that we have preparedness planning. And also that access to vaccines, health, and PPEs is guaranteed, and then that there's humane and health-focused treatment of undocumented migrants, where many are Filipinos abroad. The details are in the succeeding slides. I will not discuss this one by one. I will have copies of this, and in the interest of time. But just my last few slides. Rethinking governance, we have a lot of tools now. We have GCM, we have SDGs, we have the ILO international standards. We have to link back to this and ensure that we try to operationalize this. And also that we need to make sure that our gender-based approaches are solid, that there's coherence between national and local and across the different sectors of the economy in terms of policy and programs. And then that recruitment, we need to ensure it's not only ethical, but the fair and secure against abusive and fraudulent practices. And of course, that the gender and the migrant worker agenda are not left behind, no? That they are organic to all the recovery approaches. So I'll end here, and we can just discuss details during the question. Thank you very much.